Hi everyone, it's Mike here again. Welcome to the latest episode of Heightened Curiosity. I won't waste too much time with the usual apologies for the gap in between episodes. I know, but unfortunately, life gets in the way. But hopefully, I'll be able to keep more episodes flowing over the next few months or so. This time around, I focus on a topic which is certainly closer to my own personal interests of all things Sasquatch related, and one which is as controversial now as it was then. I've chosen to take a look at the happenings which occurred around the small Washington hamlet of Bossburg, which all kicked off in November 1969. To me, this is an event and subsequent piece of evidence which seems to be discussed less often these days. You may not be familiar with all these incredible events, and if this is the case, be prepared to buckle up. This is quite a tale. Undoubtedly, there are elements of what happened at Bossburg which don't sit well with many. Some folks refuse to look at the case simply due to the involvement of certain characters. We'll dig deep into the controversies and the shenanigans which followed the discovery of the tracks, but we'll also focus on the actual tracks themselves, which are undeniably of significant interest. After all, these are the tracks which led Grover Krantz to remark that the idea that Sasquatch could be a real animal went from a 10% possibility to 100% assuredness. That's quite a statement, huh? These tracks are, to this day, held in high regard among those whose opinions I trust. To me, they represent remarkable and highly compelling Sasquatch evidence. Let me set the scene. Bossburg is an old mining town, situated in Stevens County, Washington, almost on the banks of the Columbia River, around 25 kilometres south of the Canadian border. There isn't much left these days in Bossburg, and there'd be very little reason to stop if you drove along Washington State Route 25, which passes on through. However, it was a different story back in late November 1969, and during the months after, where the spotlight of the Bigfoot world and the interested media would focus firmly on this quiet little spot. Let's start right at the beginning. The Bossburg incident, or incidents, has many twists and turns, and I'll apologise in advance if I go off on a tangent. There is so much more to what happened here than just a bunch of large footprints in the snow. It was reported that a butcher by the name of Joseph Rhodes from the nearby town of Colville had spotted a track of large footprints whilst visiting the town's community garbage dump on November 24. There had also been a few Bigfoot sightings reported in the area previously that year. Some phone calls were made, and it was not long before some of the most respected and revered names in Bigfoot lore had descended on Bossburg to find out just what the hell was going on there. First on the scene was Rennie de Hinden, who had spoken to Ivan Marks and was advised that Marks was hot on the trail of an injured or crippled Sasquatch. De Hinden was soon joined by famed tracker Bob Titmus, who formerly headed up the Tom Slick US expedition, who had travelled almost 1,000 miles from his home in Kitimat, British Columbia. De Hinden had found that most of the initial tracks found at the Bossburg dump had been eroded by the large number of people descended on the site to see the footprints for themselves. There was one footprint, however, that had been protected by a cardboard box which had been placed over it. It showed a fairly defined large malformed right foot, which was soon photographed and cast using plaster. De Hinden spent the next few days scouting the area and speaking to the locals. Titmus, however, had a different plan of attack. Titmus was convinced that the Sasquatch, that had left the tracks at the dump, was so impeded that it relied on scraps of food from the dump and possibly other waste bins to survive. Rennie de Hinden famously, and as usual, colourfully described Titmus' attempts to ensnare the creature as follows, and please forgive me for not attempting Rennie's accent. Thomas Steenberg does a much better job than I ever could. Rennie said, "He went out and bought an 8-pound slab of beef and hung it in a tree. I believe he was sitting out there at night in his panel truck watching the meat and thinking if this thing was a cripple and living off the garbage dump, when it came along he would just grab it by the arse, throw it in the truck and run off home with it. Titmuss wasn't the only person trying this technique. Fellow Sasquatch hunter Norm Dickie Davis, who happened to own a local radio station, also tried the lure method, but using fruit as a bait this time. Both were unsuccessful, and this led Titmuss to head back to Kitimat after just a few days. However, de Hinden knew the track he had found at the dump was something extraordinary. He extended his stay in the area, taking up residence in a trailer owned by Davis. It was said that Rennie would cover his rent by showing the PGF film and giving talks on the Sasquatch subject to local groups. The trailer was soon moved to Ivan Mark's property, and the search for the triple-foot Sasquatch, as it was known at the time, was well and truly on. The use of the phrase cripple is deemed to be pretty distasteful now, but the term cripple was widely used back during this period. Apologies to anyone who may find the phrase offensive. Rennie de Hinden's perseverance paid off, and on Saturday, December 13th, along with Marks and a younger man named Jim Hopkin, they found much more than they could have hoped. Previously, on the banks of the Roosevelt Lake, Rennie had dropped some meat scraps, and the men had returned to see if anything had shown an interest in these. It was Ivan Marks who first made the find and shouted, "Bigfoot tracks!" He immediately jumped into the car and said he needed camera equipment to document what he'd seen. Rennie was quick thinking as usual. He'd spotted a Jeep parked close to the spot, and the researchers noted down the license plate. Rennie's first thought that the occupants of a Jeep could well be hoaxers. The owners of a Jeep were soon located and identified afterwards. They said they had noted the tracks and decided to get the hell out of there fast. Once the team picked up their equipment, they returned to the trackway site and saw the view of the hundreds of tracks before them. The trackway featured 1,089 tracks in total. These could be seen clearly, as some inches of snow had fallen earlier that morning. The tracks led from a river over the nearby railroad and across the main highway. De Hinden, Marks and Hopkins followed the tracks, which led over a 43-inch or 3.5-foot barbed wire fence, which the track maker seemed to have straddled without breaking stride. Over this fence he had noted where a heavy animal had rested in some pine needles. This rest area was in the line of the trackway, but of course could have been made by another animal. But tellingly, there was a clump of snow nearby showing the impression of the track maker's left foot. Beyond the pine trees, the tracks continued for some way. It is here de Hinden issued another one of his famous quotes. "Now we're going to get that hairy son of a bitch." He was confident that we were in hot pursuit of the Sasquatch. The tracks led uphill, but then turned back on themselves, and it was here the hunters found a patch of yellow snow, which was assumed to be urine from a creature. We note that the discarded snow was not unfortunately collected by either of the team, but we can forgive this, as DNA evidence was not in the forefront of the mind of a researcher back in what was still the 1960s. The tracks led back and forth over the road and the aforementioned wire fence a few times before heading down the bank to a rocky area by the river, where no further tracks were visible. Back in the late 60s, the Bigfoot Sasquatch scene was manic. Researchers genuinely felt that we were on the verge of proving the existence of the creature that was thought to be the subject of a Patterson-Gimlin film, which was of course shot just 2 years earlier. There was also the thorny issue of hoaxing to consider, which was a factor never far from Rennie de Hinden's thoughts. He weighed up the possibilities and at the time concluded that the tracks found in both incidents were genuine. The huge trackway found by him, Marks and Hawkins, and also the tracks found at the community dump earlier by Rhodes. This conclusion seemed to be vindicated just 5 days after the trackway was found. A US Border Patrolman found a set of similar looking tracks on the far side of the river, in an area that was normally closed off to the public. These tracks were far from clear, as they seemed to have been weather affected, but as they were placed on land which would normally not be traversed, the idea that these were potentially part of a hoax seemed slim. Soon Rennie had called in assistance from Ray Fardell from British Columbia and a young zoologist from San Francisco. Both were keen to help Rennie ascertain if these tracks could be genuine. Roger Patterson also appeared on the scene with his then partner Dennis Jansen. The fact that there was a potentially injured or disabled Sasquatch loose in the area was not lost on anyone, and the hunt for the creature continued with zest, assisted by funds from Ohio millionaire Tom Page. Despite the searches by off-road vehicles, snowmobiles and light aircraft overhead, the search for the lame Sasquatch yielded nothing. Many of those involved in the search began to doubt the confidence they had in the original evidence. Had a hoax been perpetrated? Had all of this just been a wild goose chase? The next element of the Bossburg story is not exactly the Bigfoot world's finest hour. I think those of us who are well versed in the types of character who is leading the charge at Bossburg would be less than surprised at how events transpired. But there's simply no escaping that the next chapter paints the Bossburg story in a much darker light. The search for the Bossburg Sasquatch continued throughout January without much success, until, at the end of the month, a certain Joe Metlow, a prospector accompanied by Bill Streeter, a state wildlife agent, showed up at the Heightened camp on Marks's property. He casually asked what the going rate would be for a live Sasquatch. He then proceeded to tell a story about having trapped a cream-coloured Sasquatch in an old abandoned mine shaft. Streeter confirmed the story was as Metlow had told him, although it seemed that Streeter had not yet seen the creature for himself. Metlow went on to say he had already found a buyer for his cream-coloured Sasquatch. Roger Patterson's sidekick, Dennis Jansen, who just so happened to be at the camp at the time of the visit, advised Metlow that he and his group, the Northwest Researchers Association, which in reality was basically just a name for Roger Patterson, would top any offer already made. Jansen advised Patterson of the latest unexpected turn of events. Patterson in turn asked Jansen to keep Metlow talking and to ensure that the Heightened crowd were kept out of any further negotiations. The group of researchers who had worked so closely together throughout January were very quickly divided. It wasn't long, however, before the Heightened crowd knew what was happening. Heightened, who was doing a tour of PGF showings in Calgary at the time, asked his team to find out what Patterson and Co were offering and to top that offer. By now, Patterson's financial backer, the aforementioned Tom Page, had flown in and set up camp with Patterson and Jansen in the nearby town of Colville. Word was that Page was willing to offer $35,000 for the Sasquatch dead or alive. It was at this point that things around Bossburg were getting pretty ugly. The researchers who had previously brought fame and wonder to this quiet part of the county were no longer well regarded. The double dealing and the spying on each other's camps did not go down well with the locals, who now wanted the circus to leave town immediately. Things were reaching fever pitch, but Metlow was not accepting offers, so seemingly the captured live Sasquatch was still available. Heightened asked John Green to assist him with negotiations while he was stuck in Calgary. Green went to the Bossburg area, but soon got caught up in the madness, and instead of protecting the interests of the Heightened camp, it was reported that Green spent his time going between the various camps trying to arrange the best deal for himself. This affected the Heightened and Green partnership irrevocably, and led to break down the relations between the two great Sasquatch legends. The bidding went on remorselessly, however. Rennie Heightened remembers making a final bid of $55,000, which is incredibly around $400,000 in today's money, from a Calgary hotel where, to quote him directly, he did not have a pot to piss in. Typical Heightened, eh? Metlow finally walked away from the negotiations without confirming or denying his story about the trapped cream Bigfoot. This, however, wasn't the end of the madness. Sometime after the cream Sasquatch debacle had simmered down, Heightened and Jansen had together paid a visit to Metlow's home. Metlow just casually dropped into the conversation but he just so happened to have a Sasquatch foot in his freezer. Clearly not learning our lesson from before, both researchers immediately started frenzied bidding just to catch a glimpse of the supposed foot. As with the cream Sasquatch in the mine, the foot did not materialise, but the ensuing shenanigans which surrounded it certainly had a massive effect, and did little for the harmony among the Bigfoot researchers involved in this fiasco. Things related from Bossburg and Sasquatch lurched from the sublime to the bizarre to the incredible. One of the main reasons why everything related to Bossburg and the events that occurred there is deemed an outright hoax is the presence of Ivan Marks. Marks was a major player in the Sasquatch scene at the time, but history has not been kind to him, and for very good reason. Marks clearly hoaxed Sasquatch evidence. Of this, there is no doubt. And it's likely he did so a good while later at Bossburg, which just so happened to be the area he called home. Not long after the Metlow claims, in November 1970, Ivan Marks called Rennie de Hinden to say, "I've got a film of a cripple." And there we have it. The circus began again. And huge offers for a film came Marks's way. However, another legendary Sasquatch researcher, Peter Byrne, who had joined the hunt for a Bossburg creature, managed to debunk the film, proving that whatever was filmed was in the human range of around 5 to 6 foot, and not the 9-foot creature which Marks had claimed. It also came to light that Marks had been buying some pieces of fur just prior to the making of the film, with the insinuation that he'd clearly created a suit with this fur. Ivan Marks was a serial hoaxer. His Sasquatch videos are available to view online, including the Bossburg cripple footage. Some of these attempts are simply hilarious. My favourite is a literally cone-headed Sasquatch, which has to be seen to be believed. You won't be surprised to learn that Ivan Marks later partnered with another controversial figure from the crazy end of the Bigfoot spectrum, Tom Biscardi. Canadian researcher Thomas Steenberg often refers to what he calls Ivan Marks syndrome. This is where you have an individual who may have been involved in legitimate research or discovered potentially valid evidence at one point, but feels the need to be constantly relevant or requires continued attention, so hoaxes subsequent evidence to ensure that the spotlight does not leave them. The happenings at Bossburg were clearly not the world of Bigfoot's finest moment. Information relating to the claims made by Metlow and Marks are chronicled in much more detail in Grover Krantz's seminal Bigfoot Evidence Book. Also in Lauren Coleman's Bigfoot, The True Story of Apes in America. Both of these are must-reads if you have an interest in this subject. I would also like to direct you to the excellent Bigfoot Encounters website, where the Bossburg happenings are presented at length. I can also wholly recommend a synopsis of the Bossburg events, which are excellently narrated by Lynn Smith on the Bigfoot Case File YouTube channel. Okay, it's clear that the whole happenings at Bossburg does not show Sasquatch research at the time in a positive light. It seems that a cannibalistic element of the modern Bigfoot scene has distinct historical roots. We had hoaxing, we had greed, we had the best researchers of the day, true legends in Bigfoot lore, doing their utmost to screw each other over to get their hands on what turned out to be a non-existent prize. Bossburg was a watershed moment for Sasquatch research in a lot of ways. However, we need to dial back to the beginning to pick out the diamonds in the rough, if you will. Remember those original tracks that were found by butcher Joe Rhodes at the community dump site? Well, those tracks are interesting. Very interesting. Remember what Krantz said about those tracks completely changing his view from Sasquatch being a remote possibility to being a bona fide, real flesh and blood animal? His 10% chance of Sasquatch reality turned into 100% no doubt about it view. We know that Krantz found the Bossburg print very compelling. But he wasn't the only one with that standpoint. Jeff Meldrum is a proponent for the tracks, and also Scottish-born primatologist John Napier. For those not familiar with Napier's work, he was a renowned British primatologist and a former primate curate at the Smithsonian, who had a significant interest in the Bigfoot phenomenon. His wonderful 1973 book, Bigfoot, The Yeti and Sasquatch in Myth and Reality, is another must-read. Napier was perhaps not as fully convinced that Bigfoot was a real animal as, say, Krantz or Meldrum, but let me cite what he had to say about the tracks at Bossburg. Napier identified the right foot deformity as Talipes equinovarus, or clubfoot. Because of the way the heels were defined in the footprints, he concluded that the cause was probably an early childhood injury. To quote Napier from page 124 of his classic aforementioned book, "It is difficult to conceive of a hoaxer so subtle, so knowledgeable, and so sick. Who would deliberately fake a footprint of this nature? I suppose it is possible, but it is so unlikely I am prepared to discount it." He went on to say, either some of the footprints are real, or all are fakes. If they are all fakes, then an explanation invoking legend and folk memory is adequate to explain the mystery. But if any of them is real, then, as scientists, we have a lot to explain. Among other things, we have to rewrite the story of human evolution. We have to accept that Homo sapiens is not the one and only living product of the hominid line. And we shall have to admit that there are still major mysteries to be solved in a world we thought we knew so well. While we are quoting scientific minds on Bossburg, let me just go back to Krantz, who stated this about the tracks. If the Bossburg tracks of a crippled individual were made by a hoaxer, then there are several considerations. One is that he had to know human anatomy with great detail. He had to be able to devise distortions of the anatomy, and he had to calculate exactly how an enlarged individual would have to be constructed in order to walk properly. That requires an elaboration of thought and knowledge that I don't think anyone in this world has. And this is what Meldrum had to say about the matter. We note with great interest that he has a different view on what caused the foot deformity. Please forgive any mispronunciation, as Jeff isn't messing around here. The track of an individual with a presumed crippled foot was discovered in Bossburg, Washington in 1969. The malformed right foot has previously been misidentified as a case of Talipes equinovarus, or clubfoot. However, it is consistent with the general condition of pes cavus, specifically metatarsus adductus, or possibly skew foot. Its unilateral manifestation makes it more likely that the individual was suffering from a lesion on the spinal cord, rather than a congenital deformity. Regardless of the epidemiology, the pathology highlights the evident distinctions of skeletal anatomy. The prominent bunionettes of the lateral margin of the foot merit the positions of the calcaneocuboid and cuboidal metatarsal joints, which are positioned more distal than on a human foot. This accords with the inferred position of the transverse tarsal joint and confirms the elongation of the heel segment. Furthermore, deformities and malalignments of the digits permit inferences about positions of the interphalangeal joints and relative toe lengths. So there we have it. Some very strong views on what the tracks at Bossburg were purported to be. There is no doubt that the tracks are impressive, and the experts who have studied them at length have been left in no doubt what these tracks indicate. We have heard from Krantz and Napier in particular that the tracks could not be faked, or it was extremely unlikely that someone would have the skills to carry this off in such a compelling manner. These claims, however, have been refuted in more recent times. We take a look at biological anthropologist and primate physiology specialist David J. Daigling's book Bigfoot Exposed. Daigling is very much the Sasquatch skeptic. His book challenges many of the popular early Sasquatch legends such as Jacko, Ape Canyon, and the Albert Ostman abduction, which is of course low-hanging fruit, as even Bigfoot proponents would and should have issues with each of these so-called incidents. Daegling does also tackle the Bossburg events of 1969 to 70. The nonsense of the metal and Mark's claims is simply music to any skeptic's ear. He also picks up on the positioning of Ivan Marks, who of course just so happened to live near where the Bossburg tracks were found. It was unclear if Marks was actively hoaxing at the time, or he was inspired by the vast sums of money being thrown at metal, and thought he could cash in by producing the Cripplefoot footage. We must also point out that Marks did not find the original prints. They were of course found by Joe Rhodes, who initially contacted Rennie de Hinden with news of the find. Rennie then called Ivan Marks, who he knew lived locally. We cannot, however, dismiss the possibility that Marks hoaxed the prints and left them to be discovered by someone else. We do know, however, that de Hinden despised hoaxers, and it has been inferred that he would not have worked with Marks if he had any suspicions that Marks was anything less than 100% genuine at that time. Back to Daegling. To me, he doesn't make the most compelling argument against the Bossburg print being faked. He does, however, make a sensible suggestion that the position taken by Krantz and Napier that the tracks could not have been faked is naive, and it's one that I wholly concur with. Daegling believes that it's possible that the hoaxer could have taken an example of a foot deformity and scaled it up to Sasquatch proportions, created stomplers to create the initial footprints at the dump, and then the 1,089 prints that made up the trackway which was found later. This is basically the crux of the Bossburg debate. Did prime suspect Marks have the foresight to pull off a hoax of this magnitude off? It's one thing to concoct a clever plan, it's something else to implement it successfully. The cast of the prints still stand up to scrutiny today, and to end this episode, I'll touch on an anecdote which I heard from Jeff Meldrum on the Bigfoot and Beyond podcast. I think it was the 100th episode edition, and Meldrum refers to the Bossburg prints as follows. And here's the Bossburg Cripplefoot, which is a cloud of suspicion hanging over it because of Ivan Marks, etc., etc. But yet, I can sit down in a room full of podiatrists and orthopedists and talk shop with them, and they're all fascinated by it. Absolutely comfortable with the anatomy and the pathology. There you have it. Let's be clear that the evidence obtained from the community dump at Bossburg all those years ago could be one of the most compelling found to date. The Bossburg case provides a wonderful insight into the manic chase underway by researchers at the time, all convinced that the proving of Bigfoot reality was just around the corner. It wasn't a matter of when, but more of a matter of who. Who would be the one to unveil the biggest scientific discovery of all time? It may be deflating to hear about the flaws of our heroes in this retelling, but there is no denying the commitment of those involved. These guys were desperate to find out the truth. Sad in some ways that they have since passed without having their views verified in the public or scientific domain. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Heightened Curiosity. I'll hopefully be back soon with another episode where again I'll be taking a look at another controversial Sasquatch related event. I won't give too much away, but this one has some parallels with the events at Bossburg, a previously maligned piece of research which may have elements which we cannot afford to dismiss. Please do all the usual stuff, folks. Like, comment, subscribe, etc. Contact us via email or Twitter with your thoughts and views. We'd love to hear what you think. The stuff that went down at Bossburg deserves your attention. Take care, everyone. Goodbye from me, Mike, and I'll be back soon.